Good afternoon and morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you all here for the third and final segment of our webinar series, Public Spaces, Gatherings, and the Performing Arts in the Time of a Pandemic, organized by Project Platypus. The objective of this is to contribute to the reflections and discussions which have been ongoing at a global level, whilst providing meaningful insights to all the participants of the fundraiser competition launched by Project Platypus on the same theme. We believe it is particularly important to address this theme today in light of the ongoing events which have seen us take to the streets to voice our opinions in the recent weeks. My name is Gustavo Carmona. I'm delighted and I'm very happy to be here moderating this with you. I am an architect and founder of Materia, studio based in Mexico City, and co-curating the efforts of this competition. Today, we have the pleasure of being honored by the presence of 5 very esteemed panelists from the fields of architecture, urban design, and the performing arts, and I'm gonna go ahead and provide a brief introduction of each one of them. Pratyush Shankar is a practicing architect and Dean of School of Environmental Design and Architecture from Navratna University, India. His written works include Himalayan Cities in 2014 and the upcoming History of Urban Form. He was awarded the 22nd JK Cement Architect of the Year Award in the Residence Design category. His core areas of interest in teaching include design studios and urban history. Thank you, Pratyush, for joining. Welcome. Sarosh Anklesaria is a practicing architect, educator, and researcher based in India and the United States. He's currently a critic at the Yale School of Architecture. He has worked with major firms such as Sangat, SOM, Herzog and de Meuron, and most recently Dillers Scofidio and Renfro, where he was involved with the design of the Shed, a revolutionary performing arts center in New York. Thank you, Sarosh. Welcome. Alexis Sanal is an architect, educator, and co-founder of Istanbul-based firm Sanal. Her recent works include creating urban design guidelines, using interactive participatory methods, understanding pacers of local markets of Istanbul as a timeless generative approach to tactical urbanism, and rethinking public libraries as enablers of localized knowledge communities. Thank you, Alexis. Anupama Hosker is an award-winning puppeteer and the founder of the Dhatu Puppet Theatre in Bangalore, India. She's experienced in every facet of the composite art form of puppetry, such as performance, puppet making, set design, script writing, as well as sound and light composition. Anupama is committed to preserving and propagating India's cultural heritage through puppetry. Thank you, Anupama. We're very excited to have you here. And last but not least, Mare Trevathan is a theater and voice artist. She works with unconventional forms of theater, such as micro-theater and site-specific theater, with architects in India drawing focus to built environments. As a voice artist, she has narrated more than 600 audiobooks. She's currently working with a group of actors investigating how live performance works in the age of the pandemic. Thank you, Mar, and thank you again, everybody. In organizing this panel, it was very important to create a multidisciplinary conversation, but also to obtain regionally diverse perspectives on the interaction between public space, everyday practices, and performing arts in the time of the pandemic. In the previous webinars, we have broadly discussed questions ranging from design and art practices, perceptions, use, and behavior of the people at large, inequities and exclusions in the light of the pandemic, the protests, and the displacement of people. One of our panelists in the first webinar pointed out that the process of emerging out of the pandemic from the personal space of the home to the space of the commons can be rife with uncertainty and fear for many of us. This has brought up the question of how can the built environment and the arts help rebuild trust in the public realm? How can they inspire a sense of confidence and solidarity by pulling us out of our collective fear and paralysis? And with that, I'd like to open that conversation to you, and please jump in. Welcome. What lies ahead?
Well, I'll jump in here. I'm sure I don't have the best response, but I'll have the first one. Um, I think that where the arts can be helpful is that there is a curiosity these days about what we're calling immersive theater, which is just a more egalitarian form that moves away from the built structure and the traditional sort of mono-directional performance in which somebody stands on a proscenium stage and shouts their ideas out to a passive audience. That has been even pre-COVID-19 has been disrupted quite a bit. I think there's real interest in the power disseminating, and I think that in this immersive theater world, we're having a lot of conversations about how you recruit and enable audience members to be self-enforcing of whatever the rules of engagement are. And so I think as we look at, say, if this social distancing becomes the new norm in public spaces, we're looking at how do you recruit the gathering, the mass, to be self-enforcers.
Thank you, Mare. Is there, when you say social distancing becoming the rule, um, do you think it really, we were previously talking right before the beginning of the webinar, is it really a social distancing that we are referring to when we speak about these new notions of keeping healthy, right, or public health measures? How is that difference really affect? I mean, because some of the drive that we're getting from one of these webinars and from many other forums in which I've been honored to be part of is people are clinging on the need for their connection over the transaction, right? A more consciously driven use of space and the time spent in that space. So to me, it's quite interesting to have this combination of families where, you know, as architects, we're constantly thinking how our built environment or designs affect the behavior in that space, in the occupants. But at the end of the day, the occupants can change the meaning and the occupation behavior of that. And you know, one of the great examples is look at the US that has been for a long time compared to India or Mexico or Turkey, you know, where in our countries, spaces change of program and use and meaning quite often given the social needs, right? But in the US, where everything was like under, you know, control, you know, stadium was for games and the streets were just for walking. Now the streets are becoming places for protest, right? Or places for art. So how do you see that happening?
How do I see what happening? How do I see?
How do you see the engagement of that, of this, you know, reframe notion of social occupancy of the space post-COVID? I mean, are there any new rules or guidelines or values for engagement that should guide how you occupy and how you design such spaces?
Yeah, well, you said many things that
Yes.
would poo, very interesting. So I'll try not to go on too long. I think that physical distancing is social distancing. It feels different. And part of the beauty of live theater are humans coming together, rubbing elbows quite literally with somebody who you didn't know previously, sharing breath. There's research about heartbeats syncing up in crowds, that we become sort of a super organism. And I think that that is shattered when you pull people, I don't know how many meters this is, 6 feet apart. In the US, of course, we're also a very car-centric culture. And so many theater artists have started experimenting with drive-in live theater. I went to a live music performance a couple of weeks ago in which a drive-in movie theater where you bring your car in and there's a little speaker. The music came through the speaker while we watched the people on the stage, and we used our headlights and our horns to applaud. And it was fun in its novelty, but it's not the same experience. And in terms of what you're talking about with the liminal spaces, and then I'll jump out here and let somebody else talk. I've been experimenting with these liminal spaces for quite some time. Site-specific theater, it happens, it is built so that it couldn't happen in any other place. You couldn't just pick it up and say, transport it to a different stage. It's an intimate experience with the built environment in which it is created. And part of the reason that I've been drawn to that is beyond just the artistic fun of having that kind of scene partner, if you will, of this built environment, but also because I think theater spaces, at least in the United States, have become these exclusive and limiting spaces, which are for rich people, they're for white people, they're for older people, and there are all these rules of conduct. Many of them are not explicit, but you can feel when you have violated one, and so people don't feel welcome. And so I'm very interested as we come back and look at how we are safe in light of a pandemic, how we also can restructure these spaces so that if it's not a liminal space, if the United States does decide to return to this is designated for this, how are more people welcome and how are more people really part of the party? I'll be quiet now.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe, sorry, Anupama, did you? I don't know if I'm, yeah, please go ahead.
I don't know, you first.
Yeah, so thank you, Mare. I think there were some really incredible things that we have to rethink. And I think that the pandemic, because it is in a sense so unique, it has never had such a kind of global resonance. It is something that we have in our lifetimes and maybe in our parents' lifetimes, you know, the comparisons to the Spanish plague, the fact that this is really, we are at an extraordinary moment. And I state this with caution because I also think one has to be objective and one cannot sort of just sound alarmist. But we are at a moment where we need to rethink fundamentals. And I think one really interesting place to start is the subject being us, ourselves. And the subject as a human being with agency, as a citizen with agency, as someone who has a voice, and the role of public space in articulating that voice. And what I find really interesting is, especially what's going on in the US, but many places around the world, is that protest, and of course the role of art in protest, is ultimately a very physical thing. And it doesn't, this binary between the virtual and the physical, between public and private, you know, all of these things are ultimately cliched binaries. And I think we're at a moment where we can radically rethink and radically reconsider, and even perhaps obliterate the very idea of casting things in binaries, because that seems to be problematic. The fact that as soon as we can go onto the street, we don't lose the virtual. And in fact, being able to be on the street is made more easy because we have the virtual. The virtual even kind of projects and allows for street performances, street protests to happen more easily than they would have in the past. So in a sense, you know, because we have the street, it doesn't mean that our virtual spaces will go away and the other way around, and vice versa. The other thing that the subject offers is the role of being both the performer and the audience, right? And I think that is something that you alluded to, Mare, and I'm sure this idea of like telling your own story is also something that is becoming very much a kind of democratization of who the audience is, and also of who the performer is. And I think that is again very interesting. And also the fact that sometimes in the same performance and in the same protest, you can be audience, spectator, and performer, at different times simultaneously. So this notion of temporality, I think, becomes critical to public space. So that's the other thing I wanted to say. And then the last thing I think we cannot help but think about this is the subject as being a kind of ecological subject, right? Because I'm kind of struck by how this is something that the pandemic, the virus, is something that was expected repeatedly. It is related to climate change, to ecological devastation. The fact that suddenly in our public spaces, we have to consider the planetary, not only are we all kind of connected, we're talking across several continents, but our actions as human beings have now impacted the planet and impacted ourselves in ways that have never ever happened in the history of humankind. And so somehow our public spaces are also interconnected, and our subjects, we ourselves, become as a body, as a collective humankind, we are embroiled in an ecological state that is very, very poignant at the time. We're forced to address it in all our actions. So I'll stop here, but I think, yes, there's a lot of things to unpack here.
Yeah, so I will address both the questions on the role of art, theater, groups coming together, and that of the social distancing or the personal distancing. In my own experience, my fellowship thesis was recreating what we lost during the Spanish flu. So my whole research went into what happened to the art form, a special kind of puppetry, and how did we lose it? Why did we lose it? And we often talk about loss of different performances in India. You hear there's an alarm saying, we are losing the folklore, we are losing this and losing that. What happens to the world during the pandemic? Of course, there's depression, the mind is gone. So the creative power comes out of sorrow also. It can be very fine-tuned. But for the creative to work, for whom am I doing this? With whom do I communicate? As much as putting people in a glass case and saying, okay, enjoy to yourself, it is possible to intellectualize what you see and fine-tune with a very, very fine-tuned urban performance. Of course, we perform for both urban and rural India, and I enjoy both in different ways. As much as it is all right, but when you feel something's lovely, you say, oh, wow, and then look at the person next to you. And you want to communicate, you want to resonate with that human next to you, because we believe in the rasa theory in India that it's a cloud of minds, it's a cloud of connoisseurs in the audience, which lifts the whole performance and which communicates and makes it sattvic, or you have the horripilation experience and that of happiness. The mindless state is reached by this group of human beings. Physical distancing, I practically, if people cannot come together and they are going to be hospitalized if they come together, but the whole process of this thought where if I am with somebody or I'm not with somebody, I'm not going to enjoy a show. So if this problem is with us on one side, let us look at the world. India is a very dynamic country. We survive. I'm still wearing the sari because the sari itself changes. We do not force it on us. It's naturally there because we change very rapidly. So change is a given thing in the nation. Food, lifestyle, language, everything changes. And given that that is what is happening, the whole of the world is going towards a change in everything, work from home. So the physical needs are primarily met. And the physical world, where food, shelter, clothing, whoever is providing all of this, their professions are taken care of. While the art scene says, and this has also happened before, this is a cycle. If we study history, which is what I did, 1918 cases of what happened, one particular case in Karnataka, they waited for a change, as I would do, because you say it's lockdown is over, it is in Bangalore, everybody else is going back to normalcy. What happens to the artist? Artist waits. There's no performance. Okay, we go virtual, but there's only so much you can enjoy. Unless it is made for it, like cinema, right? You cater to that. You see through a lens and do a production, well, it's different. But we are not, as performing artists, we are basing our work to connect with the innermost in a human being. Whatever it is, the innate nature of a human being, and we receive from them. I work in a proscenium theater, so I don't get to see my audience. But there are days when I just weep playing the puppets, because I know that I connected with the puppet and the puppet connected with the audience. For a person like me, there are so many of us who are there in performing arts. If there is no change and we just wait, the rest of the world changes. And then at some point of time, we try to connect with this changed world. And then when we try to cope with the changed world, we are kind of static with our work. We have stagnated with our work. The time taken, maybe 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, for us to get back. I'm talking about a professional performing arts personnel whose livelihood depends on art. And when you connect, you realize that nobody wants you because they went ahead. And this is how we see in India whenever there's stagnation due to socio-economic conditions, and the pandemic leads to that, we lose. So why is it that art, of course, naturally, art is always last, but then comes the first question next. What is the role of art in this pandemic? There is sorrow, there is hopelessness, and there is a fear of nothing being all right. So art, if can be provided in spaces, see, Indian performing art is not for the masses. It's not for large numbers. Ours is a very, it's for a small theater, it is for an intimate theater, because what we pass on is the, how do I translate the rasa, is at the emotional level. So we succeed in creating mindlessness in the audience, maybe for a second. But that 1 second of mindlessness state is enough to take this person out of the sorrow or the gloom and make them look at life with a fresh perspective, which is what we need when there is so much negative, so much death. Because what New York faced now, or is facing, India faced in 1918 with the Spanish flu. We are okay now, we are better now, we don't have so many deaths. But then we have gone through this and we've seen massive loss of native forms. And between urban India, see, ours is a proscenium theater which is flexible. When we go to the rural spaces where we perform at fairs, even today in the temples, with the seasons, we are invited to give performances. And the space is limited, we adjust. We are very, very flexible. And sometimes they don't even have chairs, they just put a jamkana, a carpet, a cotton dari, on which people sit and enjoy and express joy, and they express appreciation. They're very observant. We cannot, it's a different kind of a life experience when we perform in rural India. They feed as well, and we get to meet people who are very natural. They're not complicated with the world. But the same performance and the same theater is also working in urban India, where I feel, I love fine-tuning my lights to give one more depth and dimension to my audiences. But I need the audiences. Space, it's already flexible in India. We work everywhere. We work in the most sophisticated theater, and we work with just under a tree, with just a platform. And we carry a truckload of material sometimes. But given all of this, given all this flexibility, the pandemic has to, the design has to address the pandemic, because if we are not given this momentum, if art is not given momentum, and in India especially, if you are not with the times, if you're not dynamic, you are gone. We don't have a museumized culture in our country. If you're museumized, that means you're dead. So to live, we need this. Yeah, done.
Gustavo, can I come in?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Thanks, Gustavo, and thanks to all the three panelists for this wonderful provocation. I think some very specific and very domain-specific insights that Anupama gave is actually very useful when you have to visualize what should be, or to imagine what should be. And let me just pick from where Sarosh left in terms of, and I think he invokes the idea of performance, protest, and city spaces. Yeah, and one thing, this is unprecedented times. This is also something that is evolving. We are still in the middle of it. We're still shooting in the dark. We don't know where it will end. So I think we need to take things as they come. And things are still not settled. I feel that there are a lot of new things that will play out. It's unprecedented, it is evolving, and it doesn't leave us with many case studies to look at. I mean, Spanish flu would be one such example that historically we can look at, but that's like 100 years back. And also when I look at the question of the city, a lot of things have changed. And I think I would kind of problematize, Gustav, this debate with the idea of the city and its city center. Because I think one has to imagine the idea of people coming together and giving performances as essentially a phenomena of a settlement, also something that the city facilitates or encourages. And the reason I'm saying this, I'm using this opportunity also to conceptually question and reimagine what is a city really. And I think it's a good question to ask because theoretically speaking or conceptually speaking, one would imagine, and that's what one kind of vouches for, a city that allows people to come together. A city as a place that's successful, that has densities, that brings people together. Mare, Trevathan used the term almost elbows rubbing with each other when she was talking about what is an audience, and it becomes one mass or one organism. And in fact, the very similar logic applies to what makes a city public. What makes a city a place where performances can be enacted, and I'm looking at performances not only a problem of art, but I'm looking at the idea of performance as a larger issue in democracies. So if we were to expand this idea of a performance, that's what I'm urging. One can kind of reconfigure things in a variety of fashion. But if I look at the question of the city, and I would like to, it might be a kind of a binary, but it is a binary I'm using for the purpose of making an argument, the city and the countryside, right? And, city is one that is high on density, brings people together. When you are together, you innovate, you compete, you become anonymous. And becoming anonymous is very important. You need a crowd to be anonymous. And obviously, there is a liberation that happens when you're in a crowd. When you're an anonymous stranger, if I were to refer to Simel and other people. But what this pandemic might do, and I think that is something it's already beginning to do, is a kind of a romance or a move to the countryside. Yeah. And in some sense, historically, I can already see this, because there is this notion that in city, you are close to each other. It is dirty. It is grim. There are these unknown people. I don't know whether they are carriers. Let's go back to nature. And nature as being a more pristine category, nature as being something more hygienic, nature as being something, and if you extend the argument, even more civilized kind of an idea. So I think one of the things that is also happening, and we would have to be alert to that, and this is coming more from an urban historian's perspective. It could be a moment in history, very much like what happened with the Garden City movement, when people began to not believe in the idea of the city, or there was a moment when they felt that the city life is not what it used to be. So there is this sense of loss or a nostalgia. And then you say, let's go out and live in the countryside. Yeah, in a garden, in a city that's like within gardens. And in fact, the Garden City movement in itself did not do much, but had a huge impact in how American cities were planned. A lot of European cities were planned as low density, suburban, with nature and all that. And in fact, a lot many times in India, we have been also fighting against this kind of a exclusive, partnership with nature that suburban development promises, because that is very antithesis to the idea of coming together, because it promotes private property, it promotes isolation, and from a very technical perspective, it also strains the infrastructure. Yeah. So in some sense, what is the struggle in performing arts, I think, is also a struggle in how cities would be imagined and reconfigured, because I already see that move, and we have our ear to the ground because we also practice architecture. And it's very surprising. Now, this is empirical data that architects are already getting queries to do projects outside the city. Yeah, which means that, all the work in kind of believing in the idea of the city center, and it is linked to the idea of performance as a larger idea, or protest, or even performance as an art form. I think there is a kind of a shift that is already beginning to happen. So to my mind, the question is not only limited to a particular art form, or the problems of performing in a particular art, but I think the question is a larger question on the very idea of what we constitute as public, or the reconfiguration of the idea of public. And I'm just trying to, kind of, maybe I'm doing this more to help the participants who will be giving design ideas, that one can begin to look at almost an imagined scenario. And I would love to look at maybe projects. I don't have answers to this, but I would love to look at projects that locate a little performance space while imagining a utopian reconfigured city. So I'm also seeing this moment to open up imaginations to some kind of, maybe, Sarosh can help me with that. So that's what I'm just throwing some provocations here to kind of the larger idea of city and its center and its public places. That's some of my things that I had to say. But just to kind of, end this particular statement, I'm still kind of, we were in another panel again, there's so many panel discussions. I was telling Abhishek that like it's too much happening around post-pandemic public places and all. And somebody mentioned the word, the rural and urban divide. And will this moment be a moment of negotiating the rural-urban divide, because you might become more conscious of the rural or the countryside and might become more aware of it. Well, I said, well, let's see how it is. Is it knee-jerk? Is it reactionary? Or is it nature for a self? It's not a belief in the idea of the countryside. It is the city dweller coming out to the countryside. So these are some very interesting questions. And I'm just trying to take this question to larger regional, geographical, and the city in this space kind of an argument. But that's where I'll end.
I think you all are bringing incredible points of view, and what I'm also reading as a common thread here is this idea of negotiating boundaries in many terms. You know, Mare was talking about space being violated, and that led me to think, when I was listening to Sarush, that it is when you live in binaries and when you think in binaries that you cross a boundary that can get violated. So I wonder if are we seeing the possibility of an end of programmatic frontiers, you know, per se, and an early life for a sort of like a space continuum where the roles, methods, and backgrounds of people are a little bit more merged, where performing is not just from the actor, it's also from the audience, and where architecture is an ever-changing stage. And of course, that within the whole context of the city as the main provider of these experiences and connections.
Yeah, I mean, it's a. I don't know whether you addressed it to anyone or you want me to.
No, I mean, I'm
Yeah.
letting it all to you.
I'm kind of already throwing some hints here that it is very, to my mind, it is very difficult to come up with a specific solution of only making, and this is from a designer's perspective, of only designing for performing art. I'm saying that perhaps you need to reimagine new kinds of spaces of the city itself, right? Cities that are not, or spaces that are not simply reactionary to what is happening, but are also hopeful and positive. So we're not looking at glass box as an idea, right? So I think perhaps therein lies some hints or some clues in the way we imagine a city itself. That's the kind of idea that one might like to pick up. And especially, and when I especially, I'm tempted to use the word performance not with respect to a particular art form. I think we have to use the word performance, and especially with the protest that we saw in India, the anti-CAA protest, and presently what we're seeing in the US. I think we have to see it as a larger democratic process, within which obviously performance culture, specific performance culture form a subset. What do others feel about it? Maybe Anupama or Mare can come in, or Sarosh can come in and help us here.
Yeah, to answer your question, Gustavo, it is a cycle. We have come from there. We have come from a space. If you take history, we've come from a space where there was no separation. So it was one, and then we became sophisticated. And then still we try to be exclusive, but it is not true at all. For art to survive, for performance to survive, it has to be inclusive. So if we just look at history, it is a cycle. So we adapt to the needs, and with 2 decades, the adaptation's forgotten because the need is not there anymore. And then we move away from that. So there's a lot of circumstances which play a role in this. But it would be nice if we take a couple of cycles and consider sustainability. And that way we would be not going to and fro from perspectives. But once again, memory is very short-lived. Public memory is very short-lived. We will slide towards convenience.
Do you think that in that sense, and I'm drifting that question now to Sarosh, when I hear Anupama saying we come from a space where there was no separation and we have to relearn the basics, did architecture, and also to Mare, please, did architecture and the arts and the programming of cities become risk-free at some point, or they wanted to become risk-free in separating this, or fear-free, because some of the cultures that engage with risk and fear more in an everyday life. You know, they use the space differently and less segmented. Do we have to relearn fear and risk as part of our daily programmatic rituals in thinking of architecture and performing as a whole?
I think that risk is an inherent part of good art, but I think there are different kinds of risk. And so in the US frequently, shows will start with sit back and relax, which I hate, you know, it just says go be passive. You know, in order to fill one of these several thousand seat theaters, you have to do something that's quite familiar because people are sort of, you know, risk adverse, particularly when tickets cost 100 USD. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
Risk, fear.
Risk, fear. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, it's early in the United States right now. So I think that the risk of that the pandemic poses is a really different one. So I think that risk does need to be part of the art, but it doesn't feel responsible to me as a producer to ask people to come into a situation in which they are risking their health.
Sorry, I was, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I was offline briefly. I want to jump in really quickly and talk a little bit about a few things that were raised. I love the notion of addressing risk, and absolutely, I think that the idea of being constantly kind of critical and aware. I think one of the things that the performing arts does is the notion of provocation and awareness. And I think good public space does that. You know, it doesn't lull us into a kind of relaxed state. I totally agree with that. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about one of the things that Pratyush raised, which is the notion of the public and this idea of nature, the fleeing away from the city. But I think there is a even more, and all of those things are true and relevant and obviously critical, dangerous, the idea of losing the urban. But I think what's happening in India, what's happening across the world, is that not only are we going to see, and I know firsthand of so many friends who are leaving New York for Hudson and, you know, trying to get away from Manhattan, but something much more dangerous in India, which is the notion of the kind of gated community, you know, like borders within the city. So this is our enclave. The idea of wealth being used as a way of creating further exclusions within cities. And I think the role of performing arts here becomes a completely political one, and one which is extremely important. And not just performing arts, you know, the notion of public. I think we have to first of all ask the question of how do we create these provocations? How does not only public space, also performing arts, how do the arts again work tactically to provoke and to disrupt these tendencies? I think that is very, very important. I mean, you have to be, as an artist, also a vigilante, right? Like you have to sort of, and as an architect, you have to sort of reclaim what you consider to be of value. And I think this idea of vigilantism is going to be important at a time like this, because it is very easy for people to leave the city. It is very easy to create boundaries within the city, which I think is actually the more dangerous thing in places like India, where you're going to see these pockets where you're going to get walls, you're going to get borders, you're going to get boundaries, and you're going to get these checks. So you're going to create a kind of a state within a state. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the role of performance, and maybe Anupama and Mare can sort of build on this, but is the role of performance in being both political and humorous. You know, the idea that we are at a time when, you know, world leaders have seen this, you know, the idea of like mass rallies, the idea of telling the whole nation at 9 o'clock to do 9 things or whatever it is, you know, the idea of that is also a kind of performance. So the fact that performances can be co-opted, and the fact that performances, on the contrary, we've seen, you know, the rise of stand-up comedy in India, which only, you know, 10, 20 years back was not really such a big deal. And so I think that the fact that public space is political, the fact that theater is political, and that we need a political voice, and that this voice can both be humorous, but also can be tactical, can be insidious, can operate from sort of behind the radar, right? Like it doesn't have to, what can be said in theater, what can be said humorously would be considered slander, and, you know, cannot be said in a kind of serious political forum, but is perhaps even more potent, even more pungent, even more pressing when it is said through the arts. So I think that the role of the arts absolutely becomes extremely critical. And also humor, I think, is a huge part of this, and I think a really, really important part of this, because what humor does is that, again, it sometimes can say what cannot be said in a kind of normative context.
I'm gonna let, yes, please go ahead.
I was just gonna say I have little to add on to that, because I think, Suresh, you're right on. I would add maybe to the humor as a device of performance, also spectacle. And maybe Anupama wants to speak more about that, because I think she very much dwells in the art of spectacle.
Yes, Saraswati. It's been there. We survive because of that. We don't maybe talk about it, but 1st century to 6th century system of stories, we've had Panchatantra, which is just that, which speaks against a system, which speaks against administration, which you cannot voice maybe, but then you don't like, or it's the king and his subjects. And I mean, this is just an example, but it's going on. Even in my theater, whatever I do, whatever I write, it's there. And sometimes it comes out, it's refined. See, it may not directly be there because we believe in, even though it's non-propagandist, but it's life. It's a reflection of life. And if it's protest, but it's still fine-tuned to appeal to your senses, which are fine-tuned. So the aesthetics of it is maintained, but theater, whether it's puppetry or any performance, cannot survive if this element does not exist. There is no, the intellect will refuse to take it. So the very fact that we have homogeneous theater, which is for all ages, is the spectacle is for the younger ones, while the thought processes is for the elder ones. It is there. It is an integrated part of the work done. There is no separation. It's the soul, I must say. It's the soul of the design. The philosophy, without philosophy, doesn't happen. And with philosophy, the intellect works. And when that works, there is expression. And there is just fine-tuning of expression. It's just different ways of expressing, but it is it. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please. I was going to redirect the question to you, but you already have.
To connect it to questions of urban space and architecture, I also think that it's important for us as designers, architects, people invested in public space, to ask the question of, you know, whose voices are we privileging? Whose public space? You know, that I think is very important. And again, I think theater and performance can do that, because I think the word public space has become kind of, you know, it's tiring, because it just is thrown about easily. You know, it's a very kind of cheap way of legitimizing things. But I think I would rather use the word publics, and the plural is important because it indicates plurality. It indicates that it is not one kind of public space. You know, there is all kinds of movements that have you know, in the West, in this idea of very highly designed spaces that actually kill public space. And so I think the notion of, or the question of whose voices are being amplified. People who are from the rural are actually very much embedded. The idea of like urban villages, the idea of a lot of these people who perform across the country have very complex connections to the countryside, to their homes and to the rural landscape. And so I think that creating public spaces that are inclusive, but even more so, maybe they are subversive. Maybe they allow for certain voices to be amplified that otherwise may find it difficult for such voices to be amplified. So the capacity of public space to be used, but I think also importantly to be abused, I think is a very important aspect of good public space. Its inherent capacity to be abused.
And do you think the property or the capacity of a space being abused comes from design or comes from observation and empathy and occupation? I mean, can we, because there's this also, I think we're also being challenged as architects and creatives to question whether that notion of us defining how people behave and interact with space, depends solely on us, and it doesn't, I believe.
I'm thinking of, this conception of space has to somehow be open-ended, and absolutely it has a lot to do with empathy and observation, very, very important. But again, the history of architecture and the history of good public space has shown us, I'm thinking of Aldo Van Eyck and his design of how many, was it 600, or he did so many public spaces, playgrounds, in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, and a lot of these were not always used in the way in which one thought they would be used. So I think that, especially in India, I mean, we know that our public spaces are used in so many diverse ways, and ironically, it is sometimes the lesser designed ones that actually enable for these kinds of things. But I don't think it's a question of design or less design. I think it's a question of observation and creating open-ended design structures.
Just to add on to this debate of how do you create a public space that allows for subversion? And there's a very interesting story that I keep quoting, that during the Commonwealth Games, the government of Delhi dedicated a wall and they invited graffiti artists to come and do graffiti art. Obviously, no one came. They would choose to do their subversive, disruptive activity in the middle of the flyover where they're not supposed to. They will do it at a wall where you least expect it to be there. So I think this is this.
I think we're losing Pratyush. I think we lost Pratyush for a moment. Yeah, does anybody want to follow up on his idea, or do we give him a few seconds to?
I'll circle back to something that Pratyush was talking about of this idea of the optimistic architecture. And I'm struck, not being an architect myself, but in where the lessons are common, global, and where they're highly localized. And I think about in Colorado, where I live right now, the weather is beautiful. And so we are, we're able to continue as artists in some way because we're not dependent on being in an interior space. And how does that change as it starts to snow in December? Which of course in India there's a very different, architecture has a very different relationship to the elements, I think. And Pratyush is back.
Thanks for continuing the conversation. But I was just, this whole idea of subversion and vigilante. And I think its relationship with space is that you can't design for it. And if you have designed for it, then you have appropriated it. I mean, you have put them in a box. So in some sense, what we always insist in urban design or urban planning is that you can't design a city. You can't really do that, but if you're doing it, then you are actually prescribing a certain kind of behavior. But you can be conscious of the fact, and you might encourage and might be open-hearted with an empathy that people will come and do things that you don't even know right now. So cities also have to offer possibilities to a reality that is still not known. Like any art, I see also city as a place or as a configuration which we can't really predict. I think the danger is in predicting what the city should be. And that is where the kind of possibilities of appropriation, the possibility of a response to a threat that we still don't know, the possibility of a creative expression that we have no idea about can get reduced. So in some sense, that's why I've always been talking about design of public places or the idea of public. I would see it as a conceptual problem first and foremost before jumping into giving solutions. Yeah, because solutions can tend to be very finite or very specific. And I think what we rather need is a philosophical idea of what we want from our city. And somehow, in the earlier conversation, this whole idea of an art form, artist who are vigilante, or art form which is subversive, itself seems to be, and something that is in its very content uses the spaces of the city in a very new manner and in a very unconventional manner, rather than looking at the idea of a theater or idea of a singular kind of a finite typology of a theater. And I'm already imagining some productions from some performing artists or theater artists that kind of make a critique of the situation, but they do make a critique by using the space in a very different manner, which we still don't know. And perhaps therein lies some kind of an answer. So some of the answers are not really design answers, but perhaps the answers are how performance, or the idea of the performance and the idea of the space of the city, can find something new or something common. So I'm just also, wrapping that. That's what is also emerging in my mind. A new performance, maybe. Rather than to say that what is the space of the way I was always performing. I don't know, a transient performance, maybe.
Yeah, I guess when you're saying, you can't prescribe behavior, which I really love that, it also kicks into this notion of control that, at least in architects we're taught to have, right? And I would, risk in saying that the performing arts have better notion of uncontrolled moments and planning. So we still have to design. We still have to go about cities, and questions come back to us and say, what do we do now, right? And that's a common question, and that's our notion. But what I'm reading here, and I'd like to kind of ask for your, maybe towards a final statement of this, is we are having not so much the opportunity to provide yet a new, more disruptive solution, but to actually relearn the basics that have always been there, as Anupama was saying, through deep observation and empathy, the real understanding of the actual needs of the collective world as a whole, and then implement them through through our practice. Would that be a first statement in your mind?
Can I just begin with,
yes.
Yeah. So I think I would look for, I would value initiatives that not necessarily provide a solution, but that allow me to kind of address the tensions of the society and the city itself. So I would rather use this opportunity to kind of make a commentary of the world that we live in. Yeah. So to my mind, if an initiative or a strategy can make us think or question the world that we have created, either from the perspective of the question of the private life, or from the question of creating of boundaries and ghettos within our city, or from the question of, let's say, our relationship with environment and ecology, uh, or the idea of democracy. I think for me personally, and I think I'm sure everyone would have the thing, I would look for projects that that let me kind of allows me to get uncomfortable with the world that I've created, which perhaps allows me or gives me the agency to reimagine something else. That's what I'm using this moment as. So it's like all kind of fiction is actually a kind of a commentary on the world that we live in right now. It's not about the future. No science fiction is about the future. It is an anxiety of the present, right? So that's what I would look for. I almost see it as a fictional production. That's my final kind of a take on this.
Thank you, Pratyush.
Yeah, one can look at a cause or one can look at its symptom. I would rather be looking at the cause and working towards bettering that or addressing that rather than treating the symptoms. So to me, to progress towards a world where we can have the in-depth analysis of the nature of the human being, and then whatever symptoms we see, the causes of that, and if I would use art for that. And that would be happiness for me within and without. So if there is a city space, whether it's amidst nature, I was just dreaming of that, Pratyush, when you were talking about it. I was like, oh, wow. So that would be ideal. See, that brings in half the problems are solved. And then that would be just so nice. And then, as Saror says, no divisions, and look at it with a holistic viewpoint. And once again, I'm not for solving symptoms. I'm very, very happy, as he said, just creating something, even imagining it, as long as it's not equal to MC square, and that's not where it's going to be used, that's all right. But as long as we are safe in that sense, that we check it out, that would be the ideal thing. Yeah.
Thank you, Nupama. Ma, would you like to add something, or can I send you one of the questions received by some of our audience?
Sure, let's go to questions.
We got this question. I'm gonna go ahead and read it. The recent Performa Art Festival with its theme bodybuilding has shed light on the critical practices of architects taking up the role of performing artists and creating spatial performances. Say, for example, the inflatable installations of Ant Farm or Elizabeth Diller's mile-long opera. Do you see the value in such forms of spatial expressions which extend beyond the real of design as a professional serve?
As a professional, what was the last word?
Serve.
Professional serve.
He corrected it
S-E-R-V-E.
as it is service.
Service.
Oh, thank you.
Correction.
Thank you. Well, yes. So one of the panelists on the first panel, Shubharaja, and I collaborate. She is an architect and me as a site-specific theater maker training architecture students to use these spaces in subversive ways. So yes, I certainly see the value in it. I think engaging with spaces in ways that they have not been consciously designed helps designers to think about these potential vigilante uses. Yeah, and I'll be quiet for the people to speak into it.
Saroj, would you like to add to that? I thought you were going to say something.
Well, can you help me and just re-articulate the question one more time?
Sure, I'll read it again. The recent Performa Art Festival with its theme, bodybuilding, has shed light on the critical practices of architects taking up the role of performing artists and creating spatial performances. Say, for example, the inflatable installations of Ant Farm or Elizabeth Diller's Smile Long Opera. Do you see the value in such forms of spatial expressions which extend beyond the realm of design as a professional service?
Oh, hell yes, absolutely, without doubt. I think design as a professional service is, okay, I'll say this at the risk of being shot at, but is I think like the least interesting of things. You know, if I was given a brief and I just had to build the brief, you know, it's okay, I could do that, but it's less interesting. And I think that I think across the history of architecture, I think the more interesting works are the ones that architects, designers, artists have invented for themselves, or the ones where the briefs have been violated, and you know, the violation has produced, you know, totally new ways of thinking about something. So I do think that is critical, and I think that some of the works of Ant Farm, the idea of performance actually always does, and as has been said repeatedly, it does something subversive. And I think that the question of what that subversive is where your voice as an artist comes in. And here I think also to sort of connect it back to some of the previous comments, I think one must ask, what are, you know, looking at the next 20, 30 years as you know, design today may not be what design has always been, but that doesn't mean we are reinventing everything, we're reinventing the wheel. In fact, we have all of history behind us, and history serves as a tool for projection for both what to do and what not to do. But for example, you know, I'm struck that maybe the buildings of the future are not the ones that are going to be built, but maybe demolition and recycling of materials, and also making, you know, the fact, this was also said in one of these discussions that was held by Platypus, is that we need way more kind of open space. And maybe as designers, you know, our roles will be, again, different. We might have to rethink, we might have to think about how do our cities allow for more space through acts of tactical demolitions, through the reuse of materials that are perhaps in landfills or that are going to be from spolia, you know, the fact that we can mine materials in new ways. And again, I think that the question of abusing and using space is, again, not so simple that, you know, whether this is maybe where I might differ from Pratyush. I don't think it's a question of like, we cannot design it. I think we can design for a looseness, an open-endedness. And I think that allows for certain forms of appropriation that are welcome. So again, I don't think it's as simple as these can be designed for or not designed for. I think there's a kind of in-between gray zone of things that is of value, that is not being considered design, that needs to be investigated, and so on, you know.
Very interesting when you say tactical demolitions, because it also brings the question of, you know, we're always trying to do more. And I think one of the big lessons here is less is way much better now. No, not even more, less is better. And in undoing, we are reopening and resawing the cities and communities and spaces.
Right, and briefly, please allow me this kind of excursion.
Yes.
I've been more and more interested in this idea of degrowth, which is something that comes from economics. And, I think it's something that was proposed by economists, that we have to find ways of unwedding ourselves and our practices from the normative production of the city through capitalism. And we cannot continue to think that growth is an essential, sustainable growth, green growth, we never question the growth part. We always put another adjective in front of growth, and we assume that growth is like a pre-given condition. And I think, again, what the arts do is that they tell us that no, you can have so much joy, you can have so much humor, you can have the world without growth. And we have to find ways of monetizing degrowth, so maybe demolitions are one part of it. There's many different ways of thinking about degrowth, but I think it is this form of thinking that we need to prioritize, and we need to make connections with artists, with others, with maybe like-minded people in all kinds of disciplines. And this is why this place, being a cross-disciplinary forum, is so interesting. But I do think that the more we find ways of removing practice from the normative production of capitalism, that's going to be a very fundamental part of thinking through our ecological crisis, thinking through so many kind of current questions that we face as a world.
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I'd like to maybe listen to a very last idea from everybody else, that growth in its quantitative terms has to be, tackled back. We've only been interested as a society, I guess, in a growth that is measured by economics and politics and systems of certainty. And even when in the academic field, for instance, when you would actually address a project or explain a design, if you dare to go into the spiritual realm of things or the psychological realm of things, it's a risky business, right? Because we can't measure that, and whenever we cannot measure that, we feel afraid. But I do feel that type of growth is what is everything is calling out for now. It'd be interesting to see how that develops. I'm super thankful. I'll let a last word for you guys, and then I'll let Abhishek and Mitra take the panel towards the end. Appreciating your time.
Well, to the architects out there, I think that it does matter that we find a way to come back together again. I was coaching a high school graduating senior recently via Zoom, and he said he was so depressed he wasn't going to have a graduation, and that there was this sort of unceremonious cutoff from this real world exposure to his peers to like the great unknown of his future. And he said, I'm never going to see my friends again. And I think, it probably felt that way in 1918 as well, right? But that there is another side to this. So please don't despair, look for the solutions, and look how to bring us together again. I think it's really interesting to think about how screens and that technology gets integrated into built design, but please don't prioritize that over human sharing space.
Anupama, would you like to add something?
Thank you so much for bringing all of us together. It's been wonderful listening to all. The thought processes have started in other directions too. And wait and see. And good luck to all, yes.
So yeah, I'd like to take this as an opportunity to thank all of you for being here. And as the curatorial team of this competition and these webinars, I am extremely grateful to all of you for adding so much of value and depth to this conversation that is so essential at this time about public spaces, gatherings, and the performing arts. And I'd like to also, given that this is the last session of the series, I'd also like to mention that through these series of webinars, we had a wonderful opportunity of interacting with so many eminent professionals from different cultural, geographical, professional backgrounds. And these conversations have given us a lot of food for thought on many different levels, I must say. So I'm really grateful for everyone who was on the panel and who also participated in this in all of the webinars.
And you can find all the recordings on the website, including this one, in a couple of days. And if there is anything that you would like to know, ask always, you can ask us through our website. Again, thank you so much to everyone. And
we are also working towards creating snippets of conversations from the webinar, which we'll be putting up on our website, as well as social media. So I'd really appreciate if everyone on the panel, as well as the jury and the participants, can look out for these and let us know your thoughts about that. So
I just say a few things. Gustavo, wonderful moderation. Thanks for, somebody must thank Gustavo also for really provoking all of us to bring out some new things. And I think what happens is, as you go along, and when you hear other panelists, there are thoughts that begin to germinate here. And also, I mean, Netra and Abhishek, you guys are doing awesome. It's so nice to see, they were my students, and it's so nice to see them bloom and grow. And I've been recommending, I'm new to Instagram, so I'm pretty excited about following stories and all those kind of things. So I keep recommending Sorted Pundit to everyone. And it's really wonderful. It's very heartening to see you guys kind of pick up a real world complex problem. And you know, somebody was asking a question about what do you feel about architects, a new role as a performer. And here you have within Abhishek and Netra already transcending those disciplinary boundaries in their own work. So I think so congratulations and all the best. This is turning out to be something really, really interesting. And also something that that is needed right now. A kind of not a formula, knee-jerk reaction to the problem becoming another product in the market or another professional service, as what you know, Sarosh was referring to, but something that needs thought, critical thinking, makes us think. And I think you guys are doing great. So thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing this. Yes. And it, really incredible. And I'm glad that these conversations are going to be there online somewhere. And thank you again. This is great.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mare. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.